from the jungles of Nicaragua to the battlefields of First Manassas, John C. Posey's odyssey from General William Walker's freebooters to Captain Robert McFarland's 4th Alabama Infantry. And the more I researched John for this program, the more intrigued I became with him, as I think you'll see in a minute. His father published his obituary in the wake of Bull Run, of the Battle of First Bull Run, in September of 1861. It took that long for his body to be back home from the battlefield and for his father to get an obituary published. But in the obituary, the Honorable Sidney Cherry Posey wrote, quote, "It was about the hour of 1 p.m. on the 21st of July, when he was wounded by a minie ball, striking the left knee above the patella and passing out on the inside of the limb. He had fired 21 rounds at the enemy, had reloaded when he received the enemy's shot. At the moment, his regiment was ordered to fall back." And then further down in the obituary, it says, John C. Posey was born in Florence, Alabama, on the 20th day of February, 1834. His funeral cortege passed the house where he was born. He was a man of undaunted bravery, of restless energy. Went early to Kansas as a deputy surveyor, where he remained nearly 2 years and took an active and perilous part in the broiling fights between the pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers there. Afterwards accompanied General William Walker to Nicaragua and was captured with Walker's command and was brought home by Commodore Paulding. In the fall of 1858, he commenced the practice of law in Florence with his characteristic energy and self-reliance, and was a rising man in his profession. When Lincoln's proclamation came, he, John Posey, joined Captain Robert McFarland's company, 4th Alabama Infantry, Confederate States, and left home under a fixed presentiment that he would fall in battle. At the same time, truly persuaded it was his duty to offer up his life in his country's cause. His comrades bear him witness that he acted from the highest conception of the duties of the soldier, having never missed a roll call but one when he was washing his clothes at a branch, and abstaining from all the evils of camp life. So the parts about Kansas and Walker especially intrigued me. Of course, the Battle of Manassas intrigues me, but these other ones really intrigued me as well. So John's father was the Honorable Sidney Cherry Posey, a South Carolina native who came to Lauderdale County in the early 1830s. Posey was variously an attorney, probate judge, Florence Gazette editor, Methodist pastor, state legislator, planter, and one of Lauderdale County's 2 delegates to the 1861 Alabama Secession Convention in Montgomery. Judge Posey was married to Harriet Callista DePriest, a cousin of Mrs. Mary Coffey, wife of General John Coffey, and the Poseys had at least 5 known children, including their son John. Now, according to Judge William B. Wood in a July 4, 1876 historical address, quote, Judge Posey was a timid man in politics. He never thrust himself forward. If he had been as bold and ambitious as some of the politicians of the present day and pressed his claims on the party, the Democratic Party, he might have attained to the position of governor or United States senator. He was not an orator, but spoke with terseness and force. Earnest and excitable, when he did speak, it was to impress his hearers with the sincerity of what he said. Callista, the judge's wife, died in 1854, and she's buried in the Coffey family cemetery on Cloverdale Road next to the not-so-new Walmart, 3 miles north of Florence, near a daughter, Elizabeth, who died in 1840 at 3 years old, and several other Posey children and relatives. So this is Sidney C. Posey's 1850 federal population census. Now I've underlined 16-year-old John's entry where he was listed as a student born in Alabama, and the judge's real estate is valued at $8,000 in the census. So Sidney Posey was one of the largest planters in Lauderdale, not the largest planter, but one of the largest planters in Lauderdale County, property-wise. So this is the judge's 1860 agricultural census. By 1860, Judge Posey had a 1,500-acre farm with 600 improved acres and 900 unimproved acres valued at $20,000. Now, owing for those figures sometimes to not be 100% exactly right, as Kitty can attest very well, it's still a pretty sizable farm that he had. Of course, the judge was a slave owner. By 1850, and this is his 1850 slave enumeration, Judge Posey had 50 enslaved people working on his plantation, including the man in the photo, Henry Patton, who was born circa 1836 and died in 1900. Posey may have acquired Henry from Robert Miller Patton. Henry and Rachel Patton had a son, Jesse, who died in 1910, and he was a noted Florence businessman who ran a livery stable. So, good issue from Henry. So this is the location of Posey's plantation in the section 25 of Township 3 South, Range 10 West. So the modern Dibert Park in Florence was part of the old Posey plantation. So you can't really tell from those maps, but it's right there by the Martin's Family Clothing Store, just a little bit south of St. Florian. All of that area right there was the Posey estate. So this is the historical marker that tells the story of Posey, well, another Posey slave, Charles Posey, who bought property after the Civil War around 1870 from two of the judge's daughters and started his own farm. So it's now Dibert Park. Well, I don't really know much about John as a young boy. I don't really know much about John as an adult. A lot of what we're going to be seeing tonight is my surmising and connecting the dots. So I don't know what John was doing from the time he was 16 years old, living in Florence as a student, or outside 3 miles east of Florence as a student, until he got to Kansas. But John C. Posey was in, quote-unquote, bleeding Kansas. So we have Reynolds' political map of the United States showing the blue slave states, the red free states, including California, which in 1854 had been made into a free state. It had been allowed into the Union as a free state. And then you have the green territories. The territories were up for grabs by both parties, the secessionists, the abolitionists and the pro-slavery advocates. And in the newly acquired Kansas-Nebraska territories and bleeding over into Missouri, there was a lot of slavery agitation for and against. Flyers like this would have been seen all over the territory in the 1850s from both sides, trying to sway people to their point of view. Of course, we have squatter sovereignty advocate Senator Stephen Douglas, who ran unsuccessfully against Abraham Lincoln in the 1860 presidential elections. And Senator Douglas was a squatter sovereignty candidate. Basically what that meant is Douglas thought that the voters of these territories should be able to decide whether they would embrace slavery or not, which the abolitionists viewed as a backdoor to slavery and the pro-slavery advocates viewed as a backdoor to abolition. So nobody was really well, some people were, but in Kansas it tended to be one extreme or the other. And a lot of Lauderdale County residents in the 1860 election voted for Douglas. He won the popular vote. Of course, Lincoln wasn't even on the ballot. But the slavery agitation even impacted churches. Some Christian denominations separated over this, like the Baptists and the Methodists, into North and South. It even affected churches like the Christian Church, which now exists as the independent Christian churches, the Churches of Christ, and the Disciples of Christ. This slide shows Christian church elders on the left, abolitionist Party Butler, and right, pro-slavery advocate Dr. James Shannon. On March 30th, 1856, Elder Butler was tarred and cottoned, because they couldn't find any feathers, in Kansas because of his abolitionist views. On another occasion, he was mobbed and beaten with 39 lashes as per the Old Testament sentence. The firebrand Shannon made a speech before a pro-slavery convention in 1855. The passage of the 1854 Kansas-Nebraska Act by Congress deepened the opposition of Shannon in his efforts to spread slavery. So the Churches of Christ, our official, unofficial position was it's a political matter, it's left up to the individual. Campbell and Stone, the founders of our tradition, freed their slaves. They thought slavery was a moral evil and needed to be done away with slowly over time, but they didn't believe in immediate abolition. And they since it wasn't spelled out in black and white that slavery was evil in the Bible, they wouldn't make that a test of fellowship. So that caused some problems because you had anti-slavery people in the Stone Campbell tradition, and you had pro-slavery people like Butler and Shannon, who I don't know that they ever met each other. But regarding the violence in Kansas, historian Dale Watts writes, quote, "A careful search of representative sources reveals a total of 157 violent deaths during the territorial period. Of these, 56 may be attributed with some confidence to the political conflict of the slavery issue. The remaining 101 killings, 52 resulting from personal conflicts such as fights or brawls, 17 stemming directly from land disputes, 11 from lynchings, and 5 occurring during robberies. In 16 cases, information is insufficient to determine a primary motivation. Of these 101 slayings, 25 may have had politics or slavery as a significant contributing cause, but primarily they were the result of other factors." I mean, if people want to fight and kill each other, they'll find a good reason. And often politics is just an excuse. So this historian, Dale Watts, believes that both sides inflated the violence and inflated the casualties to drum up support for their side. Regardless of all this, as we noted in his 1861 obituary, Sidney Posey noted that in the 1850s, John had gone to Kansas as a surveyor and was involved in the pro-slavery agitation. Recall that the 1850 recorded him as a 16-year-old student. Sources indicate that John was in Leavenworth, Kansas territory by early to mid-1855. So this is 5th Street in Leavenworth, Kansas in the 1850s, the hotbed of where all of this slavery agitation was going on. So when exactly John got here, why he went here, his dad says he was a surveyor. So I don't know if he trained as a surveyor in his school and college education, but he shows up in the 1855 Kansas Territorial Census as a surveyor. So I don't know what he did as a surveyor. Apparently not a lot, because he got sucked into the pro-slavery agitation. His name shows up in the Kansas Weekly Herald from Leavenworth in May 4th, 1855, at an indignation meeting after a pro-slavery advocate had been roughed up and I believe killed. So John was on one of the committee appointed to draft a resolution saying we abhor and deplore this horrible murder of this innocent pro-slavery advocate who was minding his own business and wouldn't have done anything bad to anybody. Well, John also shows up as an arrival at the Leavenworth Hotel, and the DO is their abbreviation for ditto. Rather than make the dash marks, they abbreviate ditto with DO, which is insane. But saying he's from Alabama. So again, I don't know how long he stayed at the hotel or what he was doing there. This article from the Council Bluffs, Iowa Chronicle of February 27th, 1856, recounts the January 20th capture and lynching of Michigan native and abolitionist E.P. Brown at Leavenworth, Kansas, by members of the Kickapoo Rangers, one of whom apparently was John C. Posey. So how he fell in with the Kickapoo Rangers and what all else they did, I have no idea. Now this is the article where John was involved with those pro-slavery marauders who basically tortured and killed this guy named E.P. Brown. And the article notes that John was one of the men that guarded this guy while he was under guard, and that earlier it says J.C. Posey, who had acted a prominent part when Phillips was tarred and feathered. So this is not John's first rodeo. So, and I was going to look for information on the Phillips tarring and feathering and whether John was in fact involved in it, but I didn't have time. Well, I did a little bit, and I couldn't find anything. So here's a photo of the shore of Lake Nicaragua, which runs through the country. And this is Walker's theater of operations in Nicaragua with several of the key cities. He would eventually make his home base Grenada, would eventually transfer that to Rivas, but the settlers and colonists and filibusters would often come down on the ships to Greytown on the Atlantic coast and then go through go up river across Lake Nicaragua to Grenada or Managua, or sometimes they would land at San Juan del Sur and enter the country that way, which is how Walker landed when he went to Nicaragua. So this is what Grenada, Nicaragua looks like today, a really beautiful looking town. This is the presidential hacienda in Grenada. General Walker reviewing troops in the Grand Plaza of Grenada. In May of 1856, Don Patricio Rivas, a moderate legitimista and former head of state of Nicaragua, was named provisional president of Nicaragua after William Walker refused the honor in the wake of his victory at Grenada. Walker, he took the town. Walker only agreed to serve as commander of the Army of the Republic of Nicaragua. So they offered him president, but he said, no, he knelt with the President Rivas when he was inaugurated. He played it all humble and contrite. He said, no, I'm not cut out to be president, but I will be the head of the army. So President Rivas was installed as interim president till elections could be had. Walker only agreed to serve as commander of the Army of the Republic of Nicaragua. This would soon change, however, as on Sunday, June 29, 1856, after three days of presidential elections began in Nicaragua, but only in the southern territories controlled by Walker's troops, who as nominal Nicaraguan citizens were eligible to vote, thus invalidating an earlier May election, which had resulted in a three-way tie. Provisional President Don Patricio Rivas, one of the three candidates, canceled elections in the north in June, declaring Walker an enemy of the people of Nicaragua. So the government quickly turned on him. William Walker was elected president of Nicaragua, receiving 15,835 votes to Rivas's 887 votes. The other two candidates received 4,447 and 2,087 respectively, but Walker took the presidency in that way. While he was president, he redesigned the flag of Nicaragua, and that will come up again in a minute. He actually also issued his own currency from the new Republic of Nicaragua. And he began a newspaper, El Nicaraguense. It's Spanish, so I'm having El Nicaraguense. So he had one of his filibusters was an American newspaper editor that edited the newspaper. Walker also made English the chief language. The newspaper was printed half in English and half in Spanish. Well, Walker also used everything in his arsenal, in his political bag of tricks, as it were. In this article, quoting correspondence from William Walker to Father Heloise, the capitular of the Roman Catholic Cathedral chapter of Grenada, the Protestant Christian Church Disciples of Christ raised Walker, tells Father Heloise that he's gratified to learn from the Father's earlier correspondence of the support of the Catholic Church for the Republic of Nicaragua. Walker notes that without the aid of religious sentiment and religious teachers, there can be no good government, for the fear of God is the foundation of all social and political organization. And prior to his last, final 1860 invasion of Honduras, Walker had converted to Catholicism. Perhaps this had something to do with the fact that his fiancée, who had died, Ellen Martin, was a Catholic, or maybe he wanted to identify with the state religion of Nicaragua, but he did in fact convert. While President Walker was putting his government together, an outspoken, and again, remember, Walker was always an outspoken critic of slavery. However, Pierre Soule, a French native and former U.S. Senator from Louisiana, came down to Nicaragua with the ostensible view of scouting the place out and possibly investing in some bonds. Well, he goes to Walker and says that if Walker reinstituted slavery, which the Nicaraguan government, which had been abolished in Nicaragua in 1826, Southerners from the U.S., including Soule, would endorse Walker's government and flock to Nicaragua, which Walker appeared to do, enacting a decree which set aside the abolition of slavery in Nicaragua. Walker's stated goal was, quote, to bind the southern states to Nicaragua, unquote, and to, quote, make it appear that the American movement in Nicaragua did not contemplate annexation, unquote, to the U.S. Yet Walker was really playing Soule, stating that his decree only gave the appearance that slavery had been reintroduced to fool his southern supporters. And this is a criticism that people often level at Walker. The movie mentions that he was pro-slavery, then it makes a big deal of him trying to reintroduce slavery. It says he defaulted on his principles and caved into political ambition. But the authors that I've read claim that Walker really did not intend to reintroduce slavery. It was just to garner political support from people in the South like Pierre Soule. In fact, it would have taken a second decree to reintroduce slavery, a decree which Walker never made, and he was just hoping nobody would catch on. Walker's army was originally known as the Phalange Americana, or the American Phalanx, as they were a phalanx of the Army of Nicaragua. So this is a roster of some of the officers from Thursday, October 30th, 1856. General Walker formed his army, the Phalange, into 3 units: the 1st Rifle Battalion, the 1st Light Infantry Battalion, and a small cavalry unit, the Mounted Rangers. And the Rangers were equipped with the new Sharps rifle. A small number of Europeans, mostly French and Germans, served in French and German companies. Walker wrote that to the common Nicaraguan peasant, a filibuster was a sort of centaur with far more of the beast than of the man in his nature, and their surprise was great to hear the Americans speak mildly and conduct themselves quietly after the noise of the fray was over. Indeed, Walker did not allow theft, rape, or pillaging, following a strict military discipline, unlike how his men are portrayed in the Walker 1987 movie, basically a gang of drunken idiots without uniforms and without running wild, and they're portrayed as running wild in a drunken stupor. They did have uniforms, they did follow military discipline, and Walker significantly would only take volunteers. Any legitimista or democratico soldiers who had been impressed into the army, which was the tradition in Nicaragua, Walker gave them the opportunity to opt out. He only took volunteers. Upwards of 200 Democratico soldiers initially served in a Nicaraguan battalion commanded by Colonel Don Jose Maria Valle. So here's some more of the officers. Men, sometimes with their families, were induced to serve in Walker's Phalange, later the Army of the Republic of Nicaragua, for the guarantee of $25 a month pay and 250 acres of land. Estimates are that anywhere between 2,500 and 10,000, I don't think anybody's exactly sure what the exact numbers are, men, mostly from the U.S. and Europe, served in Nicaragua, with over half dying of wounds or disease. So a few more of the officers from that article. Well, as we'll see in a minute, those guys, as far as I can tell, have no local connection. However, there's the Battalion of Rangers officers. And you see they've all got American English names. Some of them brought their families down. Some of them are just here as adventurers. Walker would send recruiters back to the United States periodically to recruit more guys to come. So this is some of the officers in non-commissioned officers is what that should say, and privates in Walker's American Phalanx, ARN. There are a lot of names to research. And of course, there's John C. Posey. Now, in one case, one of the men in Walker's army was a drummer named Norris. Norris, after the battle, or right before the Battle of Grenada, asked General Walker, quote, this is from Walker's memoirs, as Norris, the drummer of the Phalange, afterwards said, when asking to be excused from serving as drum major, in every battle scene you see a drummer boy lying dead by the side of his drum. So he didn't want to be the drummer boy anymore because they're the first targets. So he was able to, he got another job in the Army. I think he transferred to the infantry. So these are photos of some, in brief biographical sketches, of some of the notable supporters of Walker's Phalange and some of his ARN officers. You'll note Burkett Davenport Fry, who died in 1891. He was later colonel of the 13th Alabama Infantry Confederate States, who commanded Archer's Brigade at Gettysburg. I didn't realize he had been in Nicaragua. Then he was eventually promoted to Confederate general, survived Pickett's charge, and taken prisoner. Then we have Charles Frederick Henningsen. I'm not going to go over all of these, just a few of them. Charles Frederick Henningsen, Parker H. French, was a one-armed con man and later became a spy for the Confederacy. There's a biography out on him that I'd like to read, the guy on the bottom. Charles Frederick Henningsen died in 1877. He was a Belgian native who fought in several European campaigns before serving as a major general in Walker's Army of the Republic of Nicaragua, and was later a Confederate brigadier general in command of the defenses of Richmond. So here we see a few more of some of the main supporters, and a lot of these guys, you'll notice, were Civil War officers on both sides, Confederate and Union. Of course, we see Pierre Soule again, who tried to get Walker to reintroduce slavery. And then we have Major Chatham Roberto Wheat, who died in 1862, a U.S. Army captain in the Mexican War, a filibuster in Cuba, who was elected to the Louisiana State Legislature, who later commanded the 1st Louisiana Wheat's Tigers Confederate States, of which Company A was called the Walker Guards. Wounded at the Battle of First Manassas, killed at the Battle of Gaines Mills, Virginia in 1862. Then we have Captain Henry Theodore Titus, who died in 1881, leader of an invasion of Cuba, Kansas border ruffian, an arrogant and divisive filibuster, who in February of 1857 actually deserted Walker's army for Panama. He was later assistant quartermaster of the Florida Militia Confederate States and the founder of Titusville, Florida. And then there's Walker's brother, Captain James Walker Jr. Two of Walker's brothers joined him in Nicaragua, James and Norval. And James died of cholera on May 15, 1856, and is buried in Nicaragua. In 1853, two of the directors of Vanderbilt's Accessory Transit Company, or ACT, Charles Morgan and Cornelius Garrison, double-crossed him and staged a coup. They manipulated the stock in their favor. They got Morgan appointed company president. Then the board voted to put a stop to the Commodore's 20% skim of company revenue. However, the Civil War in Nicaragua depressed transit company stock, and Vanderbilt was able to discreetly buy back shares of floating stock and rebuild Vanderbilt's shareholding and that of key men that he trusted. By November of 1856, Vanderbilt was top dog of the ATC again. Morgan and Garrison founded a rival shipping company, and made a deal with Walker to provide shipping to and from Nicaragua and the U.S. if Walker would revoke Commodore Vanderbilt's ATC contract on the grounds that the company was in breach of contract by defaulting on monetary payments to the Republic of Nicaragua, which Walker did. He canceled the ATC's contract. No more ships of Cornelius Vanderbilt's going to and from Nicaragua. Until this point, Vanderbilt had been a tacit supporter under the table of Walker, of the Walker regime. He even offered free passage to colonists and filibusters to Nicaragua. Walker had also tacitly supported the Commodore. Actually, both guys were really trying to use each other. Vanderbilt, hereafter, after his contract was canceled, referred to General Walker as the Tin Soldier. Vanderbilt also met with the leaders of several Central and South American ambassadors, telling the Costa Rican ambassador that Walker's new Nicaraguan flag with its 5 horizontal blue stripes on a white field with a 5-pointed red star in the center had spawned a motto of Walker's creation, 5 or none, which encapsulated Walker's aim to capture all 5 nations of Central America. This was unnecessary, as on March 1st, 1856, Costa Rican President Juan Rafael Mora had persuaded his country's assembly to declare war on William Walker, and President Patricio Rivas of Nicaragua. So Walker gets embroiled in fighting with the Central American nations, Honduras, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, Guatemala. He fights several battles and campaigns, including the Second Battle of Rivas in July of 1856. The Central American governments of Nicaragua, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador formed a coalition, the Allies, and declared war on Walker. And here's an instance where a legitimista soldier threw a rock and killed a swordsman. The swordsman had fired all the bullets out of his pistol. He was starting to draw his sword, and all this guy had was a rock because his rifle was empty, so he killed him with a rock. So he became sort of a folk hero down there, Lieutenant Castro. The weekend of November 25th, 1856, Captain Henry Theodore Titus, a pro-slavery agitator infamous as a border ruffian, left Bleeding, Kansas for Nicaragua with some 180 men. Titus, a huge bearded man who owned slaves and quote-unquote loves notoriety, wore a double-breasted frock coat and a slouch hat, which you can see, with the left side pinned up. And though only receiving a captain's commission in Kansas, he styled himself Colonel Titus. He would only let his officers address him as Colonel and not Captain, which is actually what his commission was for. On October 11th, 1856, Governor John W. Geary appointed Titus special aide-de-camp. His commission post dated to September 15th. Sometime after the Battle of Fort Titus, he even got a fort named after himself, Titus issued a call for his regiment of militia, signing himself, quote-unquote, Colonel of the 2nd Regiment of the 1st Brigade of the Southern Division of the Kansas Militia. His military career in Kansas, however, began and ended in 1856. Titus was a native New Yorker who immigrated to Florida at age 21, married a rich Southern lady, Mary Hopkins. Titus had earlier been a filibuster, having been part of Lopez's Cuban Revolution, and would go on to become assistant quartermaster of the Florida militia during the Civil War, and, as it just so happens, the founder of Titusville, Florida, which I've never been, but he founded it. I believe that John C. Posey was one of those 180 men who left for Kansas for Nicaragua, with Titus. Can't prove it, but that's how I think he got to Nicaragua. The last record of John in Kansas was in late January 1856, as we've just seen, where he was a member of the Kickapoo Rangers. So now we come to the chapter in John's life, which I've called John C. Posey and the Gray-Eyed Man of Destiny, which is how the popular press often referred to Walker, because he was a slight, slim guy. His hair was kind of blondish brown, and he had gray eyes. He doesn't look like a freebooter or a filibuster or a military general. He looks like exactly what he was, which we'll see in a minute. The term filibuster is from the Spanish filibustero, literally freebooter, an irregular military adventurer, specifically an American, engaged in fomenting insurrections in Latin American countries in the mid-19th century. And some of these guys made a career out of this. And I never knew about this until I started researching John Posey about 8 years ago. But there was a revolution, just like it seems like almost in the 70s and 80s there were revolutions going on all over Central and South America. There certainly were in the 19th century, and Americans were right smack dab in the middle of it. Well, one of Walker's men, Los Angeles Ranger and William Walker filibuster Horace Bell, stated that, quote, to sympathize with filibustering at the time was popular. An actual filibuster was a hero, a lion. These guys were kind of like soldiers of fortune. So John has cast his lot with these guys. When gold was discovered in California in January of 1848, 52-year-old Cornelius Vanderbilt of New York, huge tycoon, president of the Accessory Transit Shipping Company, and a lot of other things, was already a multimillionaire. However, he could make even more money by landing passengers to San Francisco on the Atlantic coast of Nicaragua and transporting them by river across Lake Nicaragua to the Pacific coast with a fleet of steamboats. But that would require the completion of a canal across Nicaragua. The French had already discussed just such a canal with the Nicaraguan government. They had also planned to build a railroad across the Central American Isthmus, but had run out of funds. Vanderbilt ran steamer shipping routes to and from the ports of New York, New Orleans, and San Francisco, as you can see in the map. I don't know how good you can see that. The Spanish had been ousted from Central America in 1821, and they seemed content to look after their Caribbean possessions. Vanderbilt finally signed a contract with the government of Nicaragua, which the Commodore, he was known as the Commodore because of his shipping line. He fancied himself a Commodore. He pronounced it Nicaragua, and which gave his accessory transit company the right to build a canal across Nicaragua. The contract provided for the immediate payment of $10,000, several million dollars today, to the Nicaraguan Treasury, plus $200,000 in canal company stock and $10,000 a year until the thing was finally finished. The contract required the canal to be built within 12 years, and when it was finished, the government of Nicaragua was supposed to get 20% of net profits, and after 85 years they would take ownership of the canal, but it was never completed. Not for lack of trying and scheming on Vanderbilt's part. They were men also full of military fire, thirsting for military reputation. And this is William Walker's comments on his filibusters on his Baja in Sonora campaign. On November 4th, 1853, 44 well-armed American adventurers splashed ashore at La Paz, which ironically enough means the peace, Mexico, led by 29-year-old Nashville, Tennessee native, medical doctor, lawyer, and newspaper editor William Walker. Their aim, according to Walker in his memoirs, was ostensibly that, quote, a comparatively small body of Americans might gain a position on the Sonora frontier and protect the families on the border of the U.S. from the Indians, Apache Indians. And such an act would be one of humanity, no less than of justice, whether sanctioned or not by the Mexican government, which the Mexican government didn't. It was not sanctioned by the Mexican government. Nevertheless, Rafael Espinoza, governor of Baja, was placed under arrest by Walker's filibusters. The few Mexican police disarmed, the Mexican flag was taken down, and a new flag designed by Colonel Walker, he signed himself at this point as Colonel Walker, I don't know that he ever had any official military training, was run up, comprising 3 red horizontal bars on a white field and 2 stars representing the states of Baja California and Sonora, the flag of the new Republic of Lower California. Just walked in and declared himself president after he arrested the current president. Walker then issued a proclamation declaring the Republic of Lower California a free, sovereign, and independent state and renouncing all ties to the Mexican government. His new republic was doomed. On May 8, 1854, Walker's 30th birthday, after 200 reinforcements came down to Sonora from his law partner in San Francisco, who was recruiting for him, Walker marched his men to the neighboring state of Sonora to annex it to his republic. However, attempting to cross the Colorado River on rafts, Walker lost all his cattle, the company's food supply, causing a desertion. The men deserted north to Fort Yuma in U.S. territory. A garrison of 20 men he'd left at Ensenada was wiped out by Mexican irregulars. So at this point, realizing the jig was up and that his republic was doomed, and tired of fighting Mexicans and Apache all along the way, Walker headed the column north towards the U.S. and surrendered to a squad of U.S. infantrymen from San Diego who paroled Walker and his men back to San Francisco to stand trial for violating the 1818 Neutrality Act. And ironically, just 13 days before this, the U.S. government had ratified the Gadsden Purchase, whereby the U.S. would pay Mexico $10 million for 30 square miles of Sonora, adding territory to what would eventually become the states of Arizona and New Mexico. So here's William Walker trying to proclaim himself or annex Sonora to his republic, and it already belongs to the U.S. At his trial, Walker was found not guilty. In the meantime, he'd learned of a civil war taking place in Nicaragua between the liberal Legitimista or Legitimist Party and the conservative Democraticos or Democrats. So here's the historical marker in Nashville that marks the location of Walker's house. William Walker was born in Nashville, Tennessee in 1824, one of several children born to Nashville dry goods merchant and Glasgow, Scotland native James Walker Sr. and his wife Mary Norville, who lived in this house in Nashville on the northeast corner of 4th Avenue North and Commerce Street. Apparently the house is no longer standing. It just got a historical marker. Members of the Christian Church or Disciples of Christ, a 19th century Christian reform and unity movement, which, as I said, now exists as the Churches of Christ, independent churches, and Christian churches and Disciples of Christ. James Walker intended for William to become an evangelist in that tradition. However, Walker had set his heart on becoming a doctor after his mother came down with an unknown ailment that her doctors could never diagnose, and which eventually killed her. A child prodigy, Walker started reading at an early age and entered the University of Nashville at 12. He studied medicine in Europe before returning to Nashville, leaving for New Orleans after his mother died. In New Orleans, Walker got a law degree and edited the New Orleans Crescent newspaper. In his editorials, calling out corrupt politicians and city officials and condemning slavery. His parents, James and Walker's mother, they had abhorred slavery. So he was raised to be opposed to slavery, and he was. Walker even lashed out at pro-slavery North Carolina Senator and former U.S. Vice President John C. Calhoun, writing of Calhoun, quote, "We do not rank among his admirers," unquote. Also in New Orleans, Walker was engaged for 18 months to be married to Ellen Galt Martin, who suffered from deafness as a result of childhood scarlet fever at age 5. Ellen was a Roman Catholic and eventually died of cholera in 1848, about 18 months after she and William had become engaged. In 1850, Walker relocated to San Francisco after the New Orleans Crescent went out of business, following his friend and law partner Edmund Randolph. In San Francisco, Walker was hired as co-editor of the San Francisco Herald. And it was while he was back in San Francisco, in the wake of his failed administration as president of Lower California, that Walker was persuaded to bring democracy to the Central American nation of Nicaragua by supporting the Democraticos against the Legitimistas in that country's civil war. So he said, hey, this would be a great idea. Let's go down to Nicaragua and help these guys out in their civil war and bring democracy to the locals. Now, there is a movie there are 2 films about Walker that have been made, as I understand. This is the only one that I could find, and I have it right here if anybody wants to pass that around. I bought it off of Amazon, and I didn't really like it. I can't seem to find the other one, and really the only good thing about this film, in my opinion, is that Ed Harris played William Walker and did a fantastic job. It's eerie how much he looks like the historical Walker. And Peter Boyle played Cornelius Vanderbilt, and it's amazing how much he looked like Vanderbilt and had his mannerisms down. The film was made in 1987 by British director Alan Cox, and it was purposely designed to draw attention to the Iran-Contra scandal, which was then all over the news. You guys all remember that from the 80s during the Reagan administration. Well, this movie was trying to portray the Reagan administration's support of the Sandinistas against the Contras in Nicaragua as a late 20th century reboot of William Walker's attempts to conquer Nicaragua. I mean, the movie poster says, before Rambo, before Oliver North, there was William Walker. Well, not quite. One of the advertisements for it describes it as a biopic. It's not. It pretty faithfully follows the basic gist of William Walker's story, but it's actually it's more like a comedy or a farce in some places than it is a serious film. And it's kind of surreal. There are historical anachronisms. I mean, in one scene, they show some of Walker's enemies being driven back to town in carriages in Nicaragua, and they're reading Time and Newsweek magazine with William Walker's faces on the cover. Cornelius Vanderbilt has a computer monitor in his office. And then in the next to last scene of the film, William Walker and his filibusters, right after they've fought the Second Battle of Rivas, black Navy helicopters, those big troop carrier helicopters, come down from out of the sky. A bunch of Marines jump off and arrest Walker and all his Marines, and then Walker gets shot. So it's surreal. And I wanted to like it, but really the only good thing about this film is Ed Harris. And from what I understand, the director, Alan Cox, was blacklisted from Hollywood for 20 years after this movie came out. I don't know if it's directly because of this or not, but I was going to play a clip from it, but I couldn't get my DVD player to work.
Lee, was the other movie one called Burn with Marlon Brando?
I think that's it.
Yeah.
Most of them were made of better stuff than their leader, but his swaggering air had imposed on many people, and the contests in which he was said to have been engaged gave him a sort of newspaper notoriety, thus making his name familiar as the leader of the Border Ruffians. Lockridge organized Titus and his men in a separate body, and soon a jealousy rather than rivalry sprang up between the newcomers and those acting under Walker's Lieutenant Anderson. Titus's men would only take orders from him, from the colonel, as he styled himself. Before leaving New Orleans, Titus boasted that once he and his men got to Nicaragua, he and his men would set things right within a matter of days. However, at the Battle of Castillo, Titus's force of 140 men was surprised by a smaller allied Costa Rican force, and Titus ordered his men to beat a hasty retreat, which he did. The New York Herald reported of Titus, who's a very violent man and abusive on small occasions, attacked the Titus was finally captured by British officers. So he couldn't stop running his mouth. Titus, who's a very violent man and abusive on small occasions, attacked the officers so violently with his tongue as to disgust every decent man who heard him. And Colonel Lockridge was not sorry when, as soon as they had landed at Greytown, a boat came ashore from the Cossack, arrested Titus, and took him on board the ship. So the British arrested Titus because he just couldn't keep his mouth shut. According to one newspaper report, Titus's officers swore that they would no longer serve under such a poltroon, and his men vowed that they would shoot him for his cowardice. They didn't, but they vowed to. So eventually, Colonel Titus deserted Walker's Army of the Republic of Nicaragua for Panama aboard a transit company steamer, Tennessee. However, John Posey remained with the ARN and surrendered with Walker and the ARN. Perhaps John got disgusted with the colonel's cowardice, because he's listed in that roster of guys who surrendered with Walker. So maybe he had enough of Titus's ego and cowardice. Walker, eventually realizing he was beaten, surrendered on December 8, 1857, with 407 Americans, 148 soldiers, 86 armed citizens, and 173 wounded. All through the summer of 1857, he had been feted, cheered as a conquering hero, and even met newly elected President James Buchanan, who secretly possessed a penchant for freebooters. Walker was lauded in the U.S. Senate by his idol Sam Houston, and his photo was taken by Matthew Brady. Not to be deterred from his dreams of empire, however, Walker returned to Nicaragua on November 23, 1858, with 270 well-armed filibusters, but managed to get arrested after the ambitious Commodore Hiram Paulding, U.S. Navy, landed a force of 350 Marines and sailors who rounded up Walker and all of his men. Commodore Paulding had acted without the authority of the U.S. government in arresting an American citizen on foreign soil. Colonel Commodore was forced into retirement by President Buchanan. Paulding acted without authorization, landing his men on a foreign soil, so he was ousted by the president. In 1858, Walker was tried in New Orleans for his violation of the Neutrality Act, but was exonerated, sent 111 men to the Mosquito Coast of Nicaragua to establish a bridgehead. So he was exonerated yet again. He goes back, he tries to send 111 men to the Mosquito Coast of Nicaragua to establish a bridgehead. However, their ship got stuck on a sandbar off the coast of Belize, and so the mission was abandoned. So Judge Posey wrote in John's obituary that after leaving Kansas, John was captured with Walker's command and was brought home by Commodore Paulding. So there's John's name in the list of men that surrendered with Posey. That surrendered with Walker. Well, in June of 1860, while at home in the U.S., Walker took time to hastily write his memoirs of the war in Nicaragua, which are still for sale, and it became an instant bestseller. So here's the reprint. He wrote his memoirs in third person. He wanted to emulate Julius Caesar's commentaries. In June of 1860, just before the publication of his memoirs came out, Walker mounted one final expedition with 90 loyal filibusters to try and reclaim Nicaragua, and perhaps this time all of Central America. Quote, "With us there can be no choice. Honor and duty call on us to pursue the path we've entered," he said. Walker chose to land at Trujillo in Honduras, and on August 5th attacked the Honduran fortress, taking it after a short but brutal fight. However, British warships who'd been looking for scouring the Caribbean for Walker and his men caught Walker. They were captured by a British lieutenant and a contingent of 40 Royal Marines. Then the Brits handed Walker over to the Hondurans, who promptly had Walker executed by firing squad. Before Walker was shot, the general apologized for making war on the Honduran people and said that he faced death with resolution and the hope that it was all for the good of mankind. However, by this time in 1860, Walker was old news. Few newspapers took notice of his death. He went from a celebrity and an American hero to a nobody. In an address to Congress in December, President Buchanan described Walker's death as, quote, "a happy change," unquote. So Cornelius Vanderbilt has a statue of himself outside Grand Central Station in New York. However, throughout Central America today, Walker's name ranks with Hitler and Stalin, and all he has is a humble tombstone. Attempts to have him reburied in America were rebuffed by the Honduran government. So that's his tombstone. And built in 1873 with an endowment by Cornelius Vanderbilt by Methodist Bishop Holland McTerry, one of Vanderbilt's nephews by marriage, Walker became a celebrity in another way because they did plays and shows based on him and his victories. So the theater kept him alive for a little bit. And then in 1873, Cornelius Vanderbilt, in the only charitable act he ever made on record, he endowed Vanderbilt University, ironically enough, in Walker's hometown of Nashville, Tennessee. So Vanderbilt reportedly said, "What's the use of giving folks money? It's the lazy ones beg." So did Vanderbilt have the last laugh? So here's some of the books that I used in the program, and I'm going to try to wrap this up here. John came home in around 1858, and went back into practice, opened a law practice with his father, Judge Posey. They handled the accounts for the Wright and Rice Foundry and Machine Shop. Judge Posey had served as one of Lauderdale's 2 delegates to the 1861 Secession Convention in Montgomery. Lauderdale County planter, industrialist, Alabama state legislator, and future governor of Alabama, Robert M. Patton, and the other mostly northern Alabama cooperationists were Douglas supporters, opposed to separate state secession, and wanted the issue of secession settled by a popular vote, which never happened. In this slide, we see that where Posey and Henry C. Jones are appointed representatives to represent Alabama at the secession convention.
How did they vote?
Well, most of North Alabama's delegates voted against immediate state secession. In their resolutions, earlier Robert Miller Patton, who was at the time a state legislator, had published resolutions, and these were all of these guys were Douglas supporters. The resolutions that they published for their group of cooperation, it says, resolve first that we are utterly opposed to separate state secession. Resolve second that we're in favor of a convention of the 15 slaveholding states, and that convention demand of the non-slaveholding states, whatever in its wisdom it may deem just and proper, and if that demand is not complied with, then the slaveholding states should declare the compact broken and the union dissolved. Our northern Alabama delegates, and most all of the North Alabama counties voted as cooperationists. We got outvoted by the fire eaters in South Alabama led by William Yancey. And so Alabama voted to secede without a popular election because they knew it wouldn't pass, I think. And Lauderdale reluctantly but enthusiastically supported the state. So, as we can see here, both of the secession delegates lost sons in the Confederate Army, and Henry Jones wound up serving in the Confederate Provisional Congress, but they had initially been opposed to secession. So this is John Posey's enlistment records, showing his enlistment in April of 1861, and his name shows up in the Lauderdale Dragoons as a third lieutenant. Now, when right after he enlisted, Posey had been offered a lieutenant's commission, which he turned down because nobody thought the war would actually happen. So his father said he turned down his commission. So both Judge Posey and Judge Jones wrote to Confederate officials trying to get his John's commission reinstated, but they were not successful because his service records list him as a private. So John served under Captain Robert M. McFarland, a Irish native and Lauderdale County attorney who was captain of Company H of the 4th Alabama Infantry Confederate States, the Lauderdale Dragoons, later the Lauderdale Volunteers or Lauderdale Rifles, and his family is the namesake of McFarland Park. He had been in partnership with James B. Irvin, where they're drilling, a meeting a bit for important business, and they got their artillery in February 20th, 1861, and this article says that the Dragoons, the 4th Alabama, had 7-shooter Colt's pistols, and I'm not sure if there is a 7-shooter Colt pistol, and there's where Posey's name appears in a roster of the guys from the 4th Alabama. Letters to the 4th Alabama can be addressed to Captain Robert McFarland, Winchester, Virginia. So this is the battlefield of Manassas, a map by James L. Bowen. Although the Civil War officially began when Confederate troops shelled Fort Sumter on April 12, 1861, the fighting didn't commence in earnest until the Battle of Bull Run, fought months later in Virginia, just 25 miles from Washington, D.C. Under public pressure to end the war in 90 days, Lincoln had pushed the cautious General McDowell to embark on a campaign to capture the Confederate capital in Richmond. But McDowell's troops were stopped at first Manassas, or Bull Run, by Brigadier General P.G.T. Beauregard's Confederate forces. The Federals retreated to Washington, where the Lincoln administration retooled for a war that would be waged at great human, and you guys all know this better than I do. There were 460 Union deaths at Bull Run, 1,124 wounded, and 1,312 missing or captured, while on the Confederate side there were 387 killed, 1,582 wounded, and 13 missing or captured. The 4th Alabama was positioned on Matthews Hill, and it was especially hard hit. So in a report later written after the battle, July 29, 1861, Captain McFarland wrote, and part of the page is torn, Embledon's company, which was sent to our aid, we were not long halted until ordered forward. Everyone thought we were going to charge Sherman's battery and brought his piece to a charged bayonet. When we had advanced within 75 yards of the enemy, the order was given to lie down. It so happened that the ground my company halted on was more exposed than any other position in the line. The Yankees kept close behind a hill. The first one that showed himself seemed to be an officer. I ordered one or two to shoot him. This commenced the fight. The Yankees advanced to the brow of the hill, took aim, fired, and retreated to load so that we had to shoot them while aiming at us. My men were cool and fired with great deliberation. Whenever a Yankee was killed by anyone, you could hear him tell his neighbor, I got him. The first one killed of the Lauderdale Volunteers was Jesse Zills. He was shot through the breast early in the engagement. The next one was young Borland, who was shot through the neck. The firing was kept up briskly on both sides. As an impression seemed to have seized Major Scott that we were firing on friends, and he told some of his companions, or some of the companies, to cease firing. I left my position and went to Major Scott and told him that the enemy's flag could be seen from where we were and that they'd killed several of my men already. On passage to Major Scott's position, I told Lieutenant Simpson where I was going and why. This was the last conversation I had with him. He was quite cool and did not apprehend danger. He'd received a slight wound in the arm, but did not quit his position. Shortly afterwards, I was looking along the line towards the left of the company and saw him the moment the fatal ball struck him. So we won't read the rest of that. One man named WCR, his initials WCR, says that the 4th Alabama Regiment suffered more than any other regiment engaged. So we're going to skip the rest of these for time. So there were several other casualties from the 4th Alabama. So the judge wrote John's obituary, which was published about a month and a half after the battle. And the judge wrote, "It was on or about the hour of 1 p.m. on the 21st when he was wounded by a mini ball striking the left knee above the patella and passing out on the inside of the limb. He had fired 21 rounds at the enemy, had reloaded when he received the enemy shot. At the moment, his regiment was ordered to fall back. The enemy advanced and took prisoners. The wounded left upon the ground. The soldiers of the 71st New York Regiment carried John Posey to the shade of a tree, bound up his wound, gave him a canteen of water, and left him. While the soldiers were binding up the wound and trying to staunch the blood, an officer supposed to be a major of the 71st came up and said to John, 'You look like an intelligent man. I'm surprised you should fight in so bad a cause.' To this John replied, 'I'm surprised that you northern men do not know you're fighting the intelligence of the South. I am wounded and a prisoner and can no longer carry on the rifle argument, the only sort of argument I desire to have with you.' The other soldier turned away and John saw him no more. After the lapse of half an hour, John's position under the tree exposed him to the fire of both armies as he lay between our files and those of the enemy. Seeing his exposed condition, 4 Federal soldiers placed him on a hand ambulance and carried him to a house outside the range of shot, where he lay until dark, when Captain Robert McFarland came with a wagon and carried him and 3 others to Manassas, where he arrived at daylight next morning. The attempt to save John's leg cost him his life. He suffered amputation on the 10th instant, and on the 12th died from exhaustion, not lockjaw. So he actually died as a result of his wounds. He was taken home and buried in the Coffey family cemetery, and the Florence Gazette reported on his funeral and his burial, and I'm going to stop there because I don't know how much time I've gone over, so I apologize for going over. I know we all need to eat. So if anybody wants to ask a couple of quick questions before we wrap it up.